All right, welcome back. What's our fourth reason why costs tend to be estimated and quantified more often than benefits? So often in environmental, we think about regulated industry on one side. They're in favor of less regulation, less stringent regulation generally. On the other side are all these environmental groups, right? And they're generally in favor of more regulation, more stringent regulation. So you have the Sierra Club and Greenpeace and these different organizations that are often using courts. They're doing lobbying campaigns. They're pushing for more environmental protection. So as we talked about, just like emphasizing the cost tends to lead people to think of an optimal level of pollution that's higher, if we emphasize the benefits of reducing pollution, that tends to lead us to an optimal level of pollution that's lower. So one would think that these environmental groups would actually be kind of a counterweight to what industry is doing. Industry's focusing on cost. These environmental groups, they could kind of focus on benefits, and that will, make it more of a level playing field if we're trying to accurately assess what the quantified costs and benefits are in a good cost-benefit analysis. So traditionally that hasn't happened a lot. Environmental groups, if you go back to when the modern environmental group I think of as kind of really gaining steam with Rachel Carson, Silent Spring. So think of like the 70s and 80s. We passed all these really big, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act. All of our big environmental laws are basically passed in the 70s. There's bipartisan support. There's a lot of momentum on the environmental stuff that carries to some extent into the 80s. But then we start to see more polarization. Partisan lines are drawn around the environmental issues. But so one thing that coming from the roots of the environmental movement, the modern environmental movement, is this idea that the optimal level of pollution is zero. And it is unethical to try to put a dollar sign on environmental amenities. The benefits of less pollution are a moral issue, not an economic issue, not a dollars and cents sort of issue. So that's traditionally what a lot of environmentalists who are in these groups are thinking, feeling, and acting on, right? So you didn't have the Sierra Club or Greenpeace or organizations emphasizing how many millions or billions of dollars in benefits we're getting from reduced pollution, because they thought it was unethical to basically put a dollar sign value on a life saved. If you're not willing to go there, if you say each life is priceless, as is nature itself, I'm not willing to try to put a price on it, I'm not going to quantify it, it's a justifiable position to have. My perspective, if you aren't willing to go there, then you're going to be waving your hands around a little bit about these moral issues. But on the other side are going to be people with hard numbers that get way more press, way more attention from government regulators. It carries a lot of weight to have these dollar signs attached to your argument. And so, what would be a counterweight to industry's cost estimates, environmental group estimating benefits, for a long time just wasn't happening because they weren't willing to go there. They weren't willing to use that methodology for basically moral, ethical reasons. So that did start to change. So groups like the Nature Conservancy in the 90s started really working with economists and started quantifying benefits of environmental amenities, which to some groups, a group like Greenpeace is still pretty skeptical of this sort of idea. Um, Nature Conservancy has a long history of focusing on the protection of land and conservation with kind of a land-based focus. So it's not surprising to me that they're some of the first who say, well, okay, you can think of land as being priceless because your family lived there, or maybe it's sacred, maybe it's a religious issue. You can think of land that way, but we buy and sell land all the time. We put dollar signs on it. I mean, that's kind of how our country works, our system works. You could think about the capitalist system failing the environment, and failing to protect property in certain ways. Nature Conservancy a long time ago said, well, looks like the best we can do is actually use that system, participate in it in ways that are helpful, and then we can actually get a lot more environmental protection, more conservation of land and of other environmental amenities by using property transactions, by using conservation easements, by using things that do have dollar signs attached to them, but kind of using it in a way that promotes conservation. And so other groups like Sierra Club and Environmental Defense Fund have gotten more and more on board with this idea that, okay, you can think of any individual life or maybe a piece of land or a certain ecosystem. They may be priceless, they may be sacred, but if you don't put a dollar sign on them, that means the value of them often gets treated as zero. So putting a price on them isn't easy, and it may make us feel a little bit squeamish, but in many cases it seems to be a lot better than the alternative when we don't quantify the benefits the environment provides us, and instead those benefits just get ignored. So that's been a pretty big change in the environmental movement. We've actually seen it even within nomenclature in environmental economics. If you go back to the 80s and 90s, environmental economics has always been something that quantified things, including benefits of environmental amenities, saving lives, keeping people healthy, ecosystem services, etc. A kind of sister branch that was largely based in Europe, not exclusively, but that was kind of where the central hub of ecological economics was a similar, related field of specialization within economics, but it's one that took more to the approach that some things can't be quantified, some things for ethical, moral reasons are priceless, and we're not going to try to put a price on them. So for a while there were these kind of parallel paths doing this sort of work, with environmental economics doing more quantifying benefits, ecological economics staying away from that. And really in the 90s, those two fields have gotten more and more, and so for the last 20 years, they're basically back together again. There's not a lot of daylight between ecological economics and environmental economics when most people think about those terms and the way they're used. So, a journal, Ecological Economics, that used to not publish stuff about value of statistical life now does, and they're actually one of the premier places to find quantified values of things like ecosystem services. So just like we've seen a lot of environmental groups kind of come on board with this idea of quantifying benefits, within the economic field, we've seen ecological economists getting more and more comfortable with this idea. There's still some differences. Ecological economics tends to work much more closely with other natural sciences in interdisciplinary ways that are pretty cool, that I think a lot of US environmental economists could use as a model for a lot of stuff. But that's really getting off on a tangent. We've basically helped explain now why environmental groups for a long time were not really putting resources into coming up with estimates of what the benefits of reducing pollution were. And so we didn't have that counterweight against industry's estimates of cost that were definitely being put forward on the other side. We've seen a lot of movement, and so in the last 20 years, a lot of environmental groups have started doing this more and more. And so you get the Nature Conservancy and Sierra Club and Environmental Defense Club, Defense Fund, and they're working with economists. They're quantifying benefits of reducing pollution. So they're, issuing press releases that tout the benefits that we'll get from proposed regulations, hoping to act as a counterbalance to the opposing industry group sort of estimates of cost that are talked about a lot. So there we go. There's my take on reasons why the costs of proposed regulations are talked about a lot more than the estimated benefits of them. And we'll get more into how we actually estimate those costs next week. So I'll see you then. Thanks.